Everyone loves to joke about the V6, not a four-cylinder, not a V8, just the awkward engine in the middle, right? Well, what if I told you that some of the most brilliant, most flat-out dominant engines ever built had exactly 6 cylinders in a V? And they were so good that the people in charge simply banned them. Racing bans, government bans, rules rewritten overnight to make them go away. We're counting down 10 banned V6 engines that engineers now openly call genius. Keep a tally of how many you knew, because number 1 is still banned right now. Number 10, the Volkswagen 3.0 TDI. Let's start with the only engine on this list that was banned by a government instead of a race series. The 3.0-liter TDI V6 diesel that Volkswagen and Audi put in everything from the Touareg to the Audi Q7 and the Porsche Cayenne diesel was, purely as a piece of machinery, a masterpiece. Smooth, quiet, and pulling like a freight train, it made diesel torque feel like luxury. Owners were seeing over 400 pound-feet in some tunes. Real-world highway fuel economy that gasoline V8s could only dream about. Towing ability that shamed engines nearly twice its size. Refinement so complete that many passengers never realized they were riding behind a diesel at all. And the kind of effortless passing power that made people fall in love with diesel all over again. And then, in November of 2015, the Environmental Protection Agency dropped the hammer. The 3.0 TDI got dragged into the Dieselgate scandal, accused of carrying software that behaved differently on the emissions test than it did on the road. The result? A stop sale order in the United States. Tens of thousands of vehicles frozen on dealer lots, buyback programs, billions of dollars in settlements, and an engine that could not be legally sold in America anymore. That is as banned as a road engine gets. And the collateral damage spread fast. Dealers were stuck sitting on trucks and SUVs they were legally forbidden to hand over, some of them brand new with delivery plastic still in the seats. Owners who loved their diesels suddenly found themselves holding vehicles the manufacturer would eventually buy, back like recalled toys. Some of the affected engines were later fixed, recertified, and quietly resold, but the brand new diesel passenger car market in America never recovered its footing. Buyers simply stopped trusting the word diesel on a window sticker, no matter whose badge sat above it. Here's the uncomfortable part, though. Talk to engineers off the record, and many will admit the hardware itself was brilliant. The block, the turbocharging, the refinement, the efficiency, none of that was fake. The genius was real. The way it was certified was the crime. Volkswagen paid dearly for it, and diesel passenger cars in America basically died with it, which is a strange legacy if you think about it. One of the finest 6-cylinder diesels ever engineered ended up as the engine that killed its own species on an entire continent. Genius and self-destruction sharing the same block. And honestly, the rest of this list only gets crazier from here. Number 9. The Alfa Romeo 155 V6 Ti picture. A humble Italian family sedan, revving to nearly 12,000 RPM. That was not a typo. In 1993, Alfa Romeo showed up in Germany's DTM Touring Car Championship with a 155 V6 Ti, and hiding under that boxy sedan body was a 2.5-liter V6 screaming past 11,500 RPM and making around 420 horsepower from 2.5 liters without a turbo. The all-aluminum engine weighed barely more than 230 pounds, used gear-driven cams instead of belts or chains, ran 2 injectors per cylinder with sequential injection, and carried a wildly over-square bore-to-stroke ratio lifted straight out of Formula One thinking. And here's the thing, it was built to humiliate Mercedes on home soil. It worked. Driver Nicola Larini won 10 rounds in that first season and took the championship, with Alfa winning 12 of 20 races overall. A brand new Italian car walked into the most German racing series on earth and beat everybody immediately. Larini even swept both races at the Nürburgring Nordschleife that year, a track he had reportedly never raced before, in front of a home crowd that came to watch Mercedes win. Engineers on rival teams could not believe the spec sheet. This wasn't just an engine bolted into a sedan either. The full package included four-wheel drive with a rear-biased torque split, and in later seasons, semi-automatic transmissions, active differentials, even movable radiator shutters and ground effect floors. A touring car in name, a prototype in every way that mattered. The regulatory rev limit was set at 12,000 RPM, and Alfa's own people said the engine would have happily gone further. So, what happened? The arms race happened. Mercedes and Opel answered with their own money-burning monsters. The series went international as the ITC budgets exploded past anything touring cars could sustain. And at the end of 1996, the whole championship collapsed under its own costs. The Class 1 rulebook that allowed engines like this was effectively dead, never to return. The 155 V6 Ti finished with 38 championship wins and nowhere left to race. Today, engineers talk about that little Alfa V6 the way people talk about lost technology. A production-badged touring car engine built to open-wheel standards, outlawed not by a single decision but by rules that made sure nothing like it could ever exist again. If you have ever heard one at full song at a historic event, you know. It does not sound like a sedan. It sounds like an accusation. Number 8. The Buick Indy V6 Now for the pushrod grenade that terrified Indianapolis. In the mid-1980s, Buick did something that sounded like a joke. It took its production-based V6, the same basic architecture sitting in family cars, and turned it into a turbocharged monster for the Indianapolis 500. The rules gave stock block engines extra displacement and extra turbo boost to help the little guys compete against purpose-built race engines. Buick took that charity and weaponized it. By the early 1990s, the Buick V6 was making in the neighborhood of 750 to 785 horsepower at Indianapolis, running more boost than the exotic overhead cam V8s from Cosworth and Ilmor were allowed, and the speeds were absurd. In 1992, Roberto Guerrero put a Buick-powered car on pole at a record 232.482 miles per hour, a number that stood as the fastest pole speed at Indy for decades. Gary Bettenhausen had already taken the fastest qualifying time the year before. On one lap, nothing could touch it. The problem was lap 200. The engine had a reputation as a qualifying special, brutally fast and fragile, a hand grenade waiting for the pin to fall out. As one writer put it, spinning a two-valve pushrod engine that hard, at that boost for 500 miles, was asking the valve train to survive a war. And it often didn't. Buick officially pulled the factory program at the end of 1992, admitting the racing engine had drifted far from anything resembling production hardware. But the engine refused to die. John Menard picked up the torch, hired Brayton Engineering to chase power and reliability, and the Menard-badged descendants of that Buick kept terrorizing qualifying weekends at Indianapolis for years, with Scott Brayton and others putting them at the front of the grid. But the concept was so effective that Roger Penske and Ilmor famously exploited the very same pushrod loophole to build the Mercedes engine that crushed the field in 1994. After that, the boost allowances got trimmed, the rulebooks got rewritten, and when IndyCar racing moved to a new naturally aspirated formula for 1997, the turbocharged stock block era was legislated out of existence entirely. The loophole was welded shut. Engineers now look back at the Buick program as proof of concept that a humble two-valve pushrod V6 developed hard enough could embarrass the most sophisticated racing engines on the planet. It never won the 500. It just got faster than everyone, scared the establishment, and had the rules closed over its head. Number 7, the Ferrari 126C Turbo. When Ferrari finally gave up on its beloved Flat 12 and built a tiny turbocharged V6 for Formula One, the purists nearly fainted. This was 1981, and the 126C carried a 1.5-liter 120-degree V6 with twin turbochargers hanging off it. Barely half the displacement of a modern family crossover, and it was already pushing towards 600 horsepower in race trim, with far more in qualifying as the boost wars escalated. But here's the detail most people have never heard. Ferrari didn't just try turbochargers. It also tested a version running a complex pressure wave supercharger, a bizarre Swiss device that used exhaust pressure waves themselves, bouncing through a spinning drum to compress the intake air with almost no lag. Two competing forced induction technologies developed side by side inside the same program. That is not a company dabbling. That is obsession. The turbo version won out, and in the hands of Gilles Villeneuve, the car did impossible things. At Monaco and then Jarama in 1981, Villeneuve muscled a chassis widely described as evil handling to back-to-back victories, holding off trains of faster cornering cars with nothing but horsepower and nerve. By 1982 and 1983, the V6 turbo Ferraris were winning constructors' championships. The engine had gone from heresy to the heart of the team. And remember the context. This was a company whose founder had spent decades insisting that the engine was the soul of the car and that 12 cylinders were the only proper way to build one. Abandoning that identity for a tiny blown V6 was, internally, close to sacrilege. The results made the argument for it. And then, the guillotine. As turbo power climbed past 1,000 horsepower across the grid, and the governing body watched speed spiral, the decision came down: turbocharged engines would be banned from Formula One entirely at the end of 1988. Ferrari's entire turbo V6 lineage, every lesson, every casting, every ounce of that Villeneuve-era madness was outlawed at the stroke of a pen. Modern engineers study that period like scripture, because the problems those teams solved with slide rules, encourage boost control, heat management, fuel chemistry are the same problems today's engineers attack with supercomputers. The 126C was Ferrari admitting the future had 6 cylinders, decades before the rest of the road car world came to the same conclusion. It was banned for being part of an arms race it helped to start, which, if we are being honest, is the most Ferrari thing imaginable. Number 6, the Renault Gordini Turbo V6. Every banned genius on this list owes a debt to a yellow car that the entire Formula One paddock laughed at. In 1977, Renault showed up at the British Grand Prix with something nobody had ever raced in the series, a 1.5-liter turbocharged V6, exploiting a clause that had been sitting unused in the rulebook since the 1960s. The rules said you could run a 3-liter naturally aspirated engine or a 1.5-liter forced induction engine. For over a decade, everyone treated the second option as a joke. Renault took it literally. The result at first was genuinely embarrassing. At Silverstone, the little yellow car qualified way back in 21st, lasted just 16 laps, and expired in a cloud of white smoke. It kept doing that, race after race, failure after failure, until Ken Tyrrell christened it the Yellow Teapot, and the name stuck. Rival teams reportedly placed bets on which lap the engine would let go. The whole project was treated as an expensive French eccentricity. But inside that teapot, a tiny team of engineers, the V6 itself traced back to a design drawn up by roughly 8 people in the early 1970s, kept grinding. The failures stopped. The power grew. In 1979, at the high altitude of Kyalami, where the turbo lost almost nothing and the atmospheric engines gasped, Renault took pole position. Then came 1979 at Dijon, where Jean-Pierre Jabouille, the same engineer-driver who had suffered through every humiliating retirement, drove a turbocharged Renault to victory in front of a delirious French crowd, and suddenly nobody was laughing. The sweetest footnote in the whole saga? Ken Tyrrell, the man who coined the teapot insult, would later end up running Renault turbo engines in his own cars. The joke had aged so badly that its author bought one. There's a lesson in there about mocking the weird new technology in the paddock. Within a few seasons, Ferrari, BMW, Porsche, and Honda were all pouring fortunes into turbocharged engines, chasing the idea everyone had mocked. Quick thing, if you are enjoying the countdown, go ahead and subscribe. We dig up stuff like this every week. Anyway, where were we? Number 5. The Nissan VG30 Twin Turbo. Here's a sentence you don't hear every day. A Nissan Z car beat Porsche at Daytona by 24 laps. The engine that did it was the VG30, the twin turbo 3-liter V6 from the 300ZX, prepared by Clayton Cunningham Racing for the IMSA GTS class. And what that engine did in 1994 remains one of the most complete beatdowns in American sports car racing. It started at the 24 Hours of Daytona, where Millen had put the lead car on pole. Steve Millen's own machine broke its crankshaft 9 hours in, so the team simply moved him into the sister car, which then went on to win the race outright. Overall victory, not just the class, ahead of everything else on the track. 5 weeks later, the same package won the 12 Hours of Sebring. Then the team shipped the cars to France, and the 300ZX won the IMSA GTS class at the 24 Hours of Le Mans while finishing 5th overall, hunting down actual prototypes on the Mulsanne, a production-based Japanese V6, humiliating purpose-built racing machinery at the 3 most famous endurance races in the world in a single season. Millen took the Drivers' Championship, Nissan took the manufacturer's title, and the team closed out the year winning the final 3 races in a row. So what did IMSA do about an engine that dominant? Exactly what you think. For the 1995 season, the twin-turbo V6 was declared ineligible. Turbos were banned from the class outright, and the mighty VG30 was legislated off the grid at the absolute peak of its powers. Nissan gamely stuffed a naturally aspirated V8 borrowed from the Infiniti Q45 into the same chassis for 1995, but the magic was gone, and the devastated Cunningham operation shut the program down at the end of that year, closing out 7 remarkable seasons of the 300ZX in IMSA competition. Steve Millen later said the twin turbo cars weren't even that hard to drive by the end because the engine management electronics had become good enough to tame the lag that had defined earlier turbo racers. The engine wasn't just powerful, it was polished. Engineers still speak of that VG30 with real respect because the road-going version of the same basic engine was famously overbuilt and the race program simply proved. Number 4. The Audi R18 TDI Now for the diesel that made Le Mans go quiet. Literally, when Audi first won Le Mans with diesel power in 2006, spectators were unnerved because the cars made almost no noise, just tire roar and wind. But the version engineers rave about arrived in 2011. The R18's compact 3.7-liter V6 TDI. Audi had come from a 12-cylinder diesel, then a V10, and now the rules forced displacement down by a third. Most teams would call that a punishment. Audi's engine chief called it an opportunity. The V6 used a 120-degree bank angle with the exhaust rooted inside the V, feeding a single variable geometry turbocharger, a layout so unusual it looked backwards to traditional engine builders. Tucking the hot side into the valley kept the whole package short, low, and stiff, which let the chassis designers shrink the car around it. And it meant the engineers were effectively running the engine inside out compared to convention. Audi's engine chief was so confident in the concept that the same basic architecture stayed in service for 6 straight seasons, which in prototype racing is close to an eternity. It won Le Mans immediately in 2011 with Marcel Fassler, André Lauderer, and Benoit Trellouillet sharing the car. The next year, Audi bolted a hybrid system to it, and the R18 e-tron Quattro became the first hybrid ever to win the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Then did it again in 2013 and 2014, when energy-based regulations slashed the fuel allowance by around 22%. Audi grew the engine to 4 liters, kept winning, and by 2016, the final version made over 1,000 combined horsepower while using nearly half the fuel of its ancestors at Le Mans. Thermal efficiency numbers that road car engineers would sell their souls for. So where did it go? Nowhere good. The Dieselgate scandal detonated inside the Volkswagen Group. The political appetite for celebrating diesel evaporated overnight. The cost of the hybrid arms race was spiraling, and at the end of 2016, Audi killed the program. Number 3, the MG Metro 6 R4 V6. This might be the strangest genius on the entire list, a bespoke racing V6 stuffed inside a British economy hatchback. In the mid-1980s, Austin Rover wanted into Group B rally, the most dangerous and unhinged category motorsport has ever sanctioned, Williams Grand Prix. Engineering helped develop the car, and designer David Wood created something remarkable for it, the V64V engine, a 3-liter V6 with 4 cams and 24 valves, drawing on engine architecture lessons from the legendary Cosworth DFV Formula One engine. And here's the twist. While every rival ran turbochargers, the little MG went naturally aspirated on purpose, trading peak power for instant throttle response on loose surfaces. Around 410 horsepower, mid-mounted behind the seats, driving all 4 wheels through a seam-welded chassis, all of it wrapped in bodywork, shaped vaguely like your grandmother's shopping runabout. The visual comedy was intentional. The engineering underneath it was deadly serious. 200 road-going versions were built at Longbridge in 1985 for homologation, which means ordinary people once bought what was essentially a detuned rally weapon with license plates. The competition debut showed flashes of real promise, too, with the car running at the sharp end of the Lombard RSC rally before the engine's teething problems bit. Because that was the catch. The V6 was brand new and undercooked, suffering reliability gremlins that a normal development cycle would have ironed out. It never got that development cycle. The roof simply fell in first. Midway through 1986, after a series of horrific, fatal crashes involving competitors and spectators, Group B was banned outright. The category, the 6R4, was built for simply ceased to exist, taking the whole program down with it, before the engine's teething problems had even been fully sorted. Number 2, the Honda RA168E. How exactly do you dominate a season so completely that history still hasn't matched it? You do what Honda did in 1988. Here's the setup. Formula One had already announced turbos were finished. The ban would hit in 1989. For the final turbo season, the rule makers strangled the technology on purpose. Boost was slashed from 4 bar down to 2.5, and the fuel allowance was cut from 195 liters to just 150. The message was clear. Let the turbo era die quietly. Honda rid those handcuffs and built a brand new engine specifically for them. The RA168E, a 1.5-liter V6, turbo redesigned around a smaller bore, longer stroke, and a compression ratio jumped from around 7.2 to 9.4 to 1, all in the name of squeezing every mile out of every drop of fuel. And the numbers were surreal. Roughly 685 horsepower at 12,500 RPM from an engine drinking less fuel than anything around it, running on exotic toluene heavy fuel that Honda preheated before it even reached the engine, bolted into the low-slung McLaren MP44, arguably the most famous Formula One car ever built and driven by Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost. That engine won 15 of 16 races, 15 pole positions. Senna took 8 wins and the championship. Prost took 7, and McLaren scored nearly triple the points of second place, Ferrari. A win rate of about 93.75%. Still, the most dominant single season in the sport's history. The one race that got away, Monza, where the McLarens hit trouble and Ferrari won at home just weeks after Enzo Ferrari's death. A result so poetic even Honda's engineers could hardly begrudge it. Then, the calendar flipped to 1989, and the greatest turbo engine ever built became illegal overnight. Number 1, the Formula One hybrid, V6's MGU-H. And, at number 1, an engine so clever it's being banned while you watch this. Since 2014, Formula One has run 1.6-liter turbocharged V6 hybrids, and buried inside them sits a device called the MGU-H, a motor generator attached directly to the turbocharger shaft. It harvests energy from exhaust heat, energy every other engine on Earth simply throws away, out the tailpipe, turns it into usable electricity, and can also spin the turbocharger electrically between corners so that lag, for all practical purposes, ceases to exist. That one idea helped push these engines past 50% thermal efficiency, converting more than half the energy in the fuel into actual power. For context, a typical road car engine hovers in the 30% range, and for over a century, breaking 50 was considered a fantasy for gasoline. These are, by that measure, the most efficient racing engines humans have ever produced, making over 1,000 combined horsepower from 1.6 liters while sipping a capped fuel flow. So, naturally, it's being removed. Under the 2026 regulations, the V6 survives, but the MGU-H is banned, deleted from the formula entirely. Why? The official reasons are cost, complexity, and the awkward truth that in nearly 2 decades, the technology never migrated to road cars. It was too expensive, too specialized, too much of a barrier for new manufacturers who wanted into the sport. So, the rule makers traded it for a far bigger kinetic hybrid system, tripling electrical power to around 350 kilowatts and targeting a roughly 50-50 split between combustion and electric drive, all running on fully sustainable fuel. And the deletion creates a wonderfully old-fashioned problem. Without an electric motor keeping the turbocharger spinning, turbo lag, the ancient enemy that the MGU-H had essentially cured comes creeping back into the sport. Engine builders are now dusting off anti-lag tricks and clever turbine strategies that feel like a step backward in time, precisely because the elegant solution was outlawed. Newest member of the banned list. Next video's topic? That's on you. Put what you want us to cover in the comments. The most liked comment is the one we do. Maybe there's a banned V8 list hiding out there. Maybe something completely different. You tell us. Subscribe so you don't miss it when it drops.